Hello, and welcome to our channel. Today, we invite you to listen to the moving story of Rachel and Grace, two souls who share the same DNA, but walk completely different paths. One raised in silence, the other surrounded by luxury. But neither escaped the pain of secrets, betrayal, and a love born from a lie. Can a story that begins with deception still lead to a happy ending? Does the way we enter this world decide everything? Or can love rewrite fate? Stay with us and let this emotional journey surprise your heart. In the heart of a story forged by fate and fractured by secrecy, two lives move in opposite directions, unaware of the invisible thread that binds them. In the glamorous city of Dallas, Texas, where oil money meets old wealth and appearances, our everything lives Rachel Lockwood. Raised in the lap of luxury, she's a woman who has it all: beauty, influence, elegance. Her wardrobe is envied, her name whispered in high society circles, her presence demanded at every exclusive event. But beneath the flawless facade lies a woman deeply bored, emotionally bankrupt, and painfully aware that nothing she owns brings her peace. The luxury she once adored now feels like a golden cage. Her every move is calculated, her relationships shallow, her purpose non-existent. Rachel is the kind of woman who can manipulate a room with a smile, but behind closed doors, she wonders if there's more to life than empty champagne glasses and hollow praise. A void lingers inside her, and though she can't explain it, she knows it's always been there, from the very beginning. Far from the dazzling lights and marble-floored mansions, nestled in a small, dusty town 2 hours from Dallas, another woman lives a life no less extraordinary, just extraordinarily different. Grace, sweet and unassuming, was raised by a humble seamstress named Miss Clara, a widow with nothing but a kind heart and strong hands. Their home is modest, their budget tight, but love fills every crack in the walls. Grace wakes up early each morning to brew coffee for her mother and tend to their tiny flower shop on Main Street. She knows the name of every neighbor, every customer, and every flower in bloom. Life hasn't been easy, but it's been real. She learned early on that hard work builds dignity and kindness builds legacy. Her dreams are small, simple, but deeply rooted. She's the kind of woman who'd give you her coat on a cold day, even if it's the only one she owns. Grace has never traveled far, never been on a plane, never owned anything designer, but what she does have is a soul that radiates warmth. They are identical. Two faces, one mirror, separated only by time, circumstance, and a cruel twist of fate. As infants, they were found wrapped in identical blankets, left on the steps of St. Cecilia's orphanage during a thunderstorm that washed through Dallas like a divine warning. No note, no explanation, just two perfect baby girls, abandoned, under the same roof. Within days, Rachel was chosen by a wealthy, influential couple looking for a child to complete their public image. Grace, overlooked by prospective parents, remained at the orphanage for weeks until Miss Clara, visiting the church to donate food, noticed the quiet baby girl with big brown eyes and decided to take her home. The girls were never told about each other. The system never cross-referenced their files. And so their lives began, side by side at birth, torn apart in infancy, growing up unaware that someone out there shared their face, their blood, and a fate waiting to be set in motion. While Rachel learned ballet and etiquette, Grace learned to mend socks and bake cornbread. Rachel attended exclusive academies, her days filled with tutors, languages, and debate club rehearsals. Grace sat in public school classrooms, doodling on notebooks and helping her classmates study for exams. Rachel's world was curated, from the clothes she wore to the friends she was allowed to have. She was trained to be a Lockwood, to speak with elegance, to command attention, to never let her guard down. Grace, on the other hand, was free to chase butterflies, get mud on her shoes, and dream about simple things like opening her own flower shop or taking her mother to see the ocean. The contrast between them was night and day. One was sculpted by society's expectations, the other by love. Yet somehow, they each carried a restless whisper in their chest, a question, unanswered, a silence too loud. Rachel grew into a woman who could win a room with her charm, but failed to connect with anyone beyond surface-level conversations. Her parents were distant, offering credit cards instead of affection, control instead of comfort. She dated men who were reflections of her world, ambitious, calculating, emotionally unavailable. Her life was filled with glamour, but she was emotionally starving. Grace, meanwhile, became the heartbeat of her town. Everyone knew her name. She took care of sick neighbors, organized bake sales, and helped local kids with homework. She had less, but she felt more. Every hug from her mother, every note from a grateful customer, every sunset walk reminded her of what really mattered. Yet sometimes, when the house grew quiet and her mother had fallen asleep, Grace would stare at the ceiling and wonder, was there someone out there, somewhere, who looked like her? Who felt the same tug in their heart? Rachel had everything money could buy, yet she often stood in front of the mirror, trying to recognize the person staring back. She didn't feel connected to her name, her family, or even her reflection. She began to suspect that her life had been orchestrated from the start, that her adoption was more of a business deal than an act of love. Her parents were cold, formal, and preoccupied with appearances. There were no bedtime stories, no family dinners, no true laughter. It was a house, not a home. In contrast, Grace and Miss Clara didn't have much, but they had ritual. Sunday morning hymns, Tuesday night tea, candlelight conversations about faith and dreams. Their bond was unbreakable. Miss Clara called her my little miracle. Grace believed it too, though she never imagined her miracle had a twin. Rachel lived in a penthouse where silence echoed louder than words. Grace lived in a creaky old cottage filled with music, warmth, and fresh pies cooling by the window. While Rachel traveled to Paris, Grace prayed for enough tips to pay her mother's medication. While Rachel attended galas in diamond-studded gowns, Grace wore thrift store dresses and hand-me-down coats. But both women, in their quiet moments, shared a common ache, a longing they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just loneliness. It was as if a part of them had gone missing or had never been found. Their souls were mirrors, searching for each other without even knowing it. The world had separated them, but destiny was patient, and destiny was preparing for a reunion. Rachel's Instagram was a curated masterpiece. Yachts, champagne, designer handbags, a life envied by thousands. But none of it was real. Behind the filters and the likes, she cried in silence. Her days blurred together. Her nights were haunted by emptiness. She envied authenticity, but didn't know how to touch it. Meanwhile, Grace had no online following, no audience, but she had people, real ones. Friends who brought her homemade jam, elders who trusted her with their life stories, children who called her Auntie Grace. She didn't need to be seen by the world. She was seen by the ones who mattered. And yet, even Grace sometimes felt the ghost of a missing piece. Like her story had a chapter she'd never read. Like someone out there shared her smile. And her shadow. Asterisk, the differences between Rachel and Grace were stark, but so were their similarities. Both were intelligent, intuitive, and carried deep wells of emotion. Both could feel when something was wrong before anyone else noticed. Both had a quiet strength that surprised people. And both, without knowing it, had always dreamed of a life different from the one they lived. Rachel fantasized about running away, starting over, finding someone who loved her without conditions. Grace often imagined what it would feel like to walk through a grand hotel lobby or see the skyline of a city she'd only seen on postcards. They were strangers, but their hearts beat in the same rhythm. A rhythm that was getting louder with every passing day. A rhythm that would one day bring them face to face. This story doesn't begin with a crime or a betrayal. It begins with a separation, a stolen bond. Two lives destined to intertwine, kept apart by fate, fear, or something far more sinister. Rachel and Grace don't know each other yet, but their souls do, and soon the veil will lift. A moment is coming when Rachel will look into Grace's eyes and see herself, not metaphorically, but literally. That collision will shake both their worlds. It will spark deception, heartbreak, transformation, and ultimately, truth. Because every great story begins with a secret. And the secret of these two women, the heiress and the orphan, is about to be unearthed. And once it is, there will be no turning back. It all began with something so small. Rachel wasn't looking for anyone. Not a sister, not answers, not the truth. She was simply bored. The kind of boredom that luxury can't fix. After brunch with oil tycoons and before a charity gala dripping with hypocrisy, she wandered into her father's private study. She'd been there hundreds of times before, but that day something pulled her toward the oldest cabinet, the one no one touched. Inside, folders yellowed with time. One caught her eye, a file with her adoption papers. Nothing new, but behind them, a second birth certificate. Same date, same hospital. Another baby, same weight, no name. Rachel's fingers trembled. Twins. Someone out there shared her face, her blood. Her heart raced, not with fear, but something darker. Possibility. Power. If this was true, if she had a twin sister, it wasn't just curiosity. It was an opportunity. And Rachel never let those pass her by. Within 48 hours, she had answers. A private investigator delivered a thick envelope. Photos, addresses, background reports. Grace was her name. A florist, unmarried, living in a rundown town outside Waxahachie. Her adoptive mother, Miss Clara, was dying of heart failure. Her flower shop was failing. Her savings were gone. Rachel studied the photos with fascination, not just because Grace looked like her, but because Grace looked real, natural, soft. Her smile wasn't posed. Her eyes didn't hide. It was like looking at what Rachel might have been, had life chosen differently. But sentiment wasn't what moved her. What moved her was the idea. She could leave, vanish, and Grace could take her place, just for a while. Just long enough for Rachel to disappear with her secret lover. A man one could know about. It's brilliant, she whispered to herself. She owes me that much. Rachel closed the folder, smiled at her reflection, and began planning her escape. Grace was folding towels when the knock came. Just another Tuesday. She opened the door expecting a customer, maybe a neighbor. But the woman on the porch made her breath catch. Tall, stylish, cold, but more than that, familiar. Too familiar. Her own face staring back. Grace gasped. Time stood still. The woman gave a polite, almost bored smile. "My name is Rachel," she said. "I believe we single quotes read ... sisters." Grace's world crumbled in a second. No one had ever mentioned a twin. Not Clara. Not the orphanage. And yet here this woman stood, flesh and blood proof that Grace had never been alone. They sat at the kitchen table while Rachel explained. Everything. The orphanage, the adoption, the discovery. Grace tried to keep up, but her heart thundered in her ears. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. Rachel sipped her tea, her eyes unreadable. Because I need your help. And just like that, the air changed. The truth was just the beginning. Rachel wasted no time. Her tone shifted from personal to practical. I need to disappear, she said bluntly. And I want you to take my place for a little while. Grace blinked, confused. What? Rachel leaned forward. Just for a few weeks. You go to Dallas, live in my penthouse, pretend to be me. It's simple. My staff does everything. You just need to smile, show up, and keep quiet. Grace almost laughed. It sounded like a prank, a social experiment. That's insane, she muttered, but Rachel wasn't joking. She laid it all out, the timeline, the roles, the reasons. There's a man, she added. I'm leaving with him. He's complicated. Her voice softened briefly, then sharpened again. He's waiting. I don't have time for second thoughts. Grace stared, heart pounding. You're asking me to lie, to become someone I'm not. Rachel tilted her head. No, I'm offering you a deal. One that could change your life and save someone else's. That's when she played her strongest card. I know about Miss Clara, Rachel said, her voice lower now. Her health, the treatments, the debt. Grace stiffened. How could she know that? Rachel didn't wait for a response. I'll pay you $500,000. Half now. Half when I return. That should be enough, shouldn't it? Grace stared at her, torn between rage and temptation. You dug into my life? Rachel shrugged. I had to know what would motivate you. Grace's hands trembled. She hated the manipulation. But she also knew what that money meant. A specialist for Clara, a better life, no more counting coins. No more watching her mother suffer. Rachel saw the hesitation in her eyes and leaned. You'd be doing me a favor. But more than that, you'd be giving your mother a chance. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. She had never wanted to be someone else, until now. Sleep never came that night. Grace paced the small kitchen, the offer echoing in her head. She opened Clara's door and watched her sleep, fragile, pale, barely breathing. She remembered childhood moments. Clara reading bedtime stories, singing hymns while folding laundry, praying at the foot of the bed. She thought about how much Clara had given up for her. Would it be so wrong to give something back? Even if it meant pretending to be someone she wasn't? Grace didn't want luxury. She didn't want secrets. But she wanted her mother to live. And that want began to grow into resolve. The next morning, Rachel returned. Your answer? She asked. Grace nodded slowly. I'll do it, for her, but only for her. Rachel gave a satisfied smile. Then we leave tonight. There were no hugs, no tearful goodbyes, just a contract written in silence, signed with desperation. Grace packed one suitcase. She wrote Clara a note, and by nightfall she was gone. Dallas loomed like a dream on fire. The skyline rose from the ground like glass blades, sharp and cold. Grace sat in the back of Rachel's luxury car, hands clasped, heart hammering. She wore clothes she didn't recognize. Her hair was pulled tight. Her skin smelled like perfume she couldn't pronounce. Rachel had drilled her the entire drive. Names of assistants, favorite wines, how to fake a laugh. Do not cry, she warned. Rachel Lockwood does not cry in public. Grace had nodded, absorbing every detail. But now, as the car pulled up to Lockwood Tower, her courage cracked. The building was a monument to excess. Guards, marble floors, glass elevators that moved like whispers. The penthouse? A world of white and chrome. You'll stay here, Rachel said. No one suspects anything. Keep it that way. Then, with a final glance, Rachel stepped into another car and vanished. Grace stood alone in a world that had never been meant for her. The first night felt like a fever dream. Grace wandered through the penthouse, trailing her fingers across surfaces too expensive to touch. The closets were bigger than her entire flower shop. She opened drawers full of diamond earrings, silk scarves, lipsticks with names like Midnight Scandal. Everything smelled like power and loneliness. She sat at the vanity, looked into the mirror, and whispered, "Who are you?" The reflection didn't answer. It only stared back, perfect, polished, terrified. She practiced Rachel's smile, the tilt of her head, the disinterest in her eyes. The staff came and went, addressing her with rehearsed respect. No one looked. Twice, no one asked questions. It was terrifying how easy it was to disappear into someone else's skin. That night, as Dallas shimmered beyond the windows, Grace stood barefoot on the balcony and whispered a prayer. Not for strength, but for forgiveness. Because deep down, she already knew. This wasn't going to be temporary. Grace learned quickly. The next morning, she walked into a boardroom with trembling knees and left with applause. She memorized names, returned messages, smiled at enemies. Rachel had trained her well, but Grace's intuition filled the gaps. She listened more than she spoke. She studied people, and slowly they began to believe she belonged. But the guilt never left. Every compliment felt like theft. Every secret she learned about Rachel's business dealings, her fake friendships, her failing marriage, was a weight she couldn't carry. Yet she did, for Clara, for the promise she made. And something else began to grow in her, anger, not at Rachel, but at the system, at the lies people lived, at how easily power covered up emptiness. Grace played the role, but she also began asking silent questions. Why did Rachel want to leave so badly? Who was this man she vanished with? And what kind of danger had Grace stepped into? Because this wasn't just a game. Rachel's escape wasn't clean. There were people looking for her, men who didn't belong in charity events or boardrooms. Grace noticed them outside the tower. Dark cars, unfamiliar faces. She received phone calls with no voice on the other end. Notes slipped under the door. "You're running out of time." The staff began to act strangely. One assistant quit suddenly. The driver avoided her eyes. Something was wrong. And Rachel? She hadn't checked in once. Grace tried calling. No answer. The last thing Rachel had said before leaving was, "Don't trust anyone." Grace hadn't understood then. She was starting to know. The walls of Rachel's life were not just made of money. They were made of secrets. Dangerous ones. And Grace was no longer pretending to be Rachel Lockwood. She was her, in every way that mattered. And the cost of that choice was only beginning to reveal itself. Part superior to Formulario, part inferior to Formulario. From the outside, Rachel's life was a flawless illusion. But once Grace stepped into her sister's world, she realized it was not a life. It was a performance on the edge of collapse. Every morning began with an assistant updating her on appointments she didn't understand and people she didn't know. Grace had to memorize names, business ventures, even Rachel's favorite cocktails. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages. From powerful people, most of them fake smiling sharks. At first, she stumbled. She said the wrong name, forgot a board member's wife, paused too long before answering a question. But surprisingly, no one noticed. In this world, people saw only what they expected to see. And what they expected from Rachel Lockwood was confidence, coldness, and control. Grace quickly learned that if she smiled with her eyes low and her voice steady, she could get away with anything. But the house wasn't empty. The penthouse staff operated like silent shadows, and some of them had been with Rachel for years. Especially Mrs. Langford, the stern, sharp-eyed housekeeper who had once worked for Rachel's adoptive family. Grace sensed her distrust from the very beginning. The older woman would linger in doorways, study her with quiet suspicion, and ask questions too specific to be casual. "Do you want your espresso with almond milk today, Miss Lockwood? Or oat milk, like you used to prefer?" Grace would smile, answer quickly, and pray she guessed right. But Mrs. Langford missed nothing. And though she remained outwardly polite, her eyes said, "You're not her. I know you're not." Grace couldn't afford a single slip. She started reading Rachel's journals, scanning her emails, anything to learn how to be her. At night, she barely slept. Every breath felt like a lie, held too long underwater. The Lockwood mansion wasn't just a penthouse. It was a palace built on silence and tension. Grace quickly discovered that Rachel's marriage to Daniel Lockwood was nothing like the tabloids portrayed. He was a powerful businessman, tall, intense, always in control, and utterly distant. Their interactions were cold, mechanical. At dinners, he barely spoke. When he did, it was formal and clipped. "Pass the wine, Rachel. Are you attending the gala next Friday?" He never looked her in the eye for more than a second. Grace realized something painful. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience. It was a battlefield frozen in time. Rachel had hurt him, deeply. And Daniel had built walls so high, even his own emotions couldn't climb them anymore. But Grace, with her gentle voice and unfamiliar tenderness, began to stir something in him, even if neither of them understood what it meant yet. Then there were the stepchildren, 2 teenagers from Daniel's previous marriage. Eleanor, 17, brilliant and bitter, had turned rebellion into an art form. Lucas, 15, withdrawn and sharp-eyed, watched Grace like she was a puzzle. They hated Rachel. That much was clear. Eleanor would roll her eyes whenever Grace entered a room. "Trying out a new personality today, Mother?" She'd say, venom dripping from every syllable. Lucas, on the other hand, was quiet. But his silence was heavier than words. Grace tried her best to reach them. She helped with homework, left notes on the fridge, made small gestures Rachel would have never bothered with. At first, the kids rejected every attempt. But slowly, cracks appeared. Lucas asked her to proofread an essay. Eleanor cried one night and let Grace hold her, just for a moment. They were broken too. And deep down, Grace saw them not as enemies, but survivors in a loveless house. Daniel started noticing. At first, it was subtle. The way she looked at him during dinner, with kindness instead of calculation. The way she spoke to the children gently, without judgment. One evening, after a tense business meeting, Grace brought him tea. "You look tired," she said softly. Daniel stared at her, confused. "You've never said that before." Grace swallowed. "Maybe I should have." He said nothing, just studied her for a long time. The tension between them began to shift. It wasn't love, not yet, but something had cracked open. Grace wasn't Rachel, and Daniel sensed it. He didn't know what it was, but something about her felt real, familiar, warm. And in a house that had grown cold with bitterness, that warmth was dangerous. It made Daniel start watching her more closely. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity. And maybe, unknowingly, with hope. But Grace wasn't just pretending. She was changing. The girl who once feared lying now woke up every day inside a deception so deep it swallowed her own reflection. Her voice became Rachel's. Her walk, her posture, her expressions, all mimicked to perfection. But at night, when she sat alone on the marble bathroom floor, she would whisper her own name. "Grace, my name is Grace," just to remember who she was. The penthouse felt like a dream and a prison. She began forgetting what it felt like to be hugged by Clara, to walk barefoot through the flower shop, to smell fresh bread baking at dawn. Every day was a performance. And though she was succeeding, every success felt like betrayal. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Too many people were watching. Too many lies had already been told, and Clara still needed her. So she kept going. One breath, one lie, one day at a time. Outside, the world adored her. Rachel's image was more beloved than ever. Magazines praised her new maturity and softer tone. Old friends noticed her change in energy. Business associates called her easier to work with. Grace smiled through it all, wondering how no one could see the difference. But the longer she lived as Rachel, the more she saw the broken pieces her sister had left behind. Rachel had enemies, hidden debts, a closet full of secrets. One day, Grace found a locked drawer in Rachel's private study. Inside, love letters from a man named Alexei, written in Russian and English. Another day, she found a burner phone with encrypted messages, names she didn't recognize, locations that didn't make sense. Grace's hands shook as she scrolled through them. Whatever Rachel was running from ... it wasn't just boredom. It was danger. Real, possibly fatal danger. And Grace was now wearing the target. Mrs. Langford's suspicions deepened. One afternoon, she cornered Grace in the hallway. "Your perfume has changed," she said. "And you've started humming again. You used to hum when you were a child, before the accident. Strange that it's come back now." Grace's throat tightened. She forced a smile. "I guess I'm just remembering who I used to be." Langford nodded slowly, but her eyes never blinked. Grace could feel it. The wall between them was thinning. At any moment, the truth could slip. She started checking the locks twice at night, avoiding deep conversations, faking headaches. But it wasn't just Langford. The driver watched her through the mirror. The security guard lingered too long when opening the lobby door. Everyone was polite, but eyes were everywhere, watching, waiting, and the scariest part? Rachel still hadn't called. Not once. Grace was beginning to wonder if her sister would ever come back at all. One night, after a gala, Daniel knocked on her bedroom door. He never had before. Grace opened it, heart pounding. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. He didn't speak right away, just stared at her. "You've changed," he finally said. "You look at me like I'm human again." Grace's voice trembled. "Maybe I just see you now." A long silence stretched between them. Then he asked, "Are you still the woman I married?" Grace hesitated. "Would you?" "Believe me if I said no?" Daniel blinked. Something inside him flickered. He stepped closer. "I don't know what's happening, but I don't hate it." Grace smiled sadly. She wanted to tell him the truth. But how could she? The man she was starting to care about still thought she was someone else. And if she told him now, she'd lose everything, including the pieces of herself she just started to reclaim. The world of the imposter was no longer a role. It was becoming a reality. Grace couldn't tell where Rachel ended and she began. Her conscience whispered one thing, but survival screamed another. She had tried to play a part, but the part was changing her. Every choice had consequences. Every silence was a new lie. She was trapped in a mansion of mirrors, all reflecting someone she was pretending to be. And the scariest part? A part of her liked the power, the admiration, the closeness to Daniel, the healing she saw in Eleanor, the purpose. But shadows lingered. Rachel's secrets, Rachel's enemies, Rachel's unfinished game. Grace had stepped into her sister's shoes, thinking it was temporary, but fate had other plans, because the world had already accepted her as Rachel Lockwood. And soon, not even Grace would remember who she truly was. The silence before the storm came in whispers. Late-night wind brushing against the balcony, a phone that didn't ring, a gut feeling Grace couldn't shake. She should have been relieved. Daniel was finally warming up to her. Eleanor had started opening up. Even Lucas had cracked a smile. But something was wrong. Rachel had been gone for weeks. No calls, no texts, nothing. Grace checked the burner phone. Still dead. She had convinced herself Rachel was living a fantasy somewhere far away with her mysterious lover. But the truth was darker, closer, and already creeping through the edges of her perfect illusion. That night, as Grace sat alone at the kitchen island sipping tea she no longer enjoyed, she whispered out loud, "Where are you?" And in the quiet that followed, somewhere far from her penthouse safety, Rachel Lockwood opened her eyes in a hospital bed and remembered everything. It had been a car crash, brutal, fiery, and nearly fatal. Rachel had been driving through the Texas desert with Alexei, arguing about something neither of them remembered clearly. Then headlights. Then screams. Then darkness. When she awoke, days later, in a sterile hospital room under a fake name, Rachel didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Her body was bruised, her ribs cracked, but her mind was intact. And when she saw Alexei's name no longer on the visitor list, she knew he'd left her, vanished. She was alone, powerless, replaced, and all she could think of was Grace, her twin, her copy, her pawn. Rachel's lips curled. She took it, she whispered. She actually took it all. And that's when the plan changed. No more running, no more disappearing. She would return, not as a victim, but as a storm. Rachel left the hospital 2 days later under a forged identity, her body still aching, but her mind razor sharp. She didn't call Grace. She didn't go home. Not yet. She stayed in shadows, watching, researching, tracking. And the first time she saw Grace on TV, giving a statement on behalf of the Lockwood Foundation, her heart twisted. "She's good," she muttered. "Too good." Rachel recognized the smile, the practiced tilt of the head. She knew because she had trained her. But Grace had added something else, warmth. Rachel never had that. It made her sick. She clenched her fists. "You think this is your life now? You think they love you?" She pulled her hood tighter over her head. "Let's see how long that lasts." Rachel had survived the desert, survived Alexei, survived betrayal. And now she was ready to reclaim what was hers, one lie at a time. Back in the Lockwood penthouse, Grace felt the shift. She couldn't explain it. A drop in temperature, a sudden coldness behind her reflection in the mirror. The staff was quiet, too quiet. Eleanor snapped at her during breakfast. Lucas avoided her completely. Even Daniel seemed distracted again, like something inside him had pulled away. She asked if anything was wrong. He said, "I don't know. You just seem different again." Grace forced a smile, the one Rachel had perfected. But doubt had already crept into her heart. She started dreaming of shadows, mirrors cracking, of someone knocking at the door in the middle of the night. She woke in sweats. The performance was getting harder, not because she couldn't act, but because she no longer knew who the audience was. Something ... someone ... was watching. Rachel didn't reveal herself all at once. That would have been too easy. No, she started slowly, feeding poison into the edges of Grace's new world. An anonymous letter arrived for Daniel. No return address. Inside, a photo of 2 baby girls at an orphanage, stamped with the date of their birth. Daniel asked no questions, but his expression darkened. The next day, Mrs. Langford received a call from someone claiming to be Rachel Lockwood, inquiring about the state of the house, the staff, the children. She sounded strange, Langford told Grace, but her voice, it was hers. Grace laughed it off. "Scammers," she said, but her fingers trembled. Then came the email to the Lockwood Board of Trustees. One line only. The woman representing your interests isn't who you think she is. Attached, a copy of Grace's original adoption file. The cracks were widening, and Rachel was just getting started. Grace tried to hold it together. Every morning, she repeated her lines, maintained her schedule, kissed Daniel's cheek like it meant nothing, even though it was beginning to mean everything. But the foundation beneath her was crumbling. Eleanor confronted her after school. "Did you ever think about telling us the truth?" she asked. Grace froze. "What do you mean?" Eleanor shrugged. "I mean, whoever you are, whoever you really are." Her voice was calm, dangerous. Lucas, standing in the doorway, didn't speak, but his eyes said it all. Grace tried to deflect. "I think you're confused," but the damage had been done. They were suspicious now, and suspicion, in a house like this, was the beginning of the end. Daniel became colder again. He stopped answering her questions, stopped meeting her gaze. One night, she walked into his study and found him staring at his computer screen, frozen on a paused video, a news interview from a decade ago. Rachel, at 21, giving a speech. Grace's heart sank. "Researching your wife?" she asked. Daniel didn't look at her. "Trying to remember who she was," he said. Grace wanted to scream. "She's not coming back. I am her now." But the words stayed trapped. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him watch the past. And for the first time since this all began, she wondered what happens when the truth comes out. Because it wasn't a matter of if, it was only when. Rachel made her move. One stormy Friday evening, she walked through the lobby of Lockwood. Tower dressed in black, sunglasses hiding the bruises that remained. The staff froze. Mrs. Langford dropped her tray. Grace was in the elevator when she heard the scream. "She's back." The doors opened on the penthouse floor, and there she was, standing in the hallway like a ghost made flesh. Rachel, pale, fierce, smiling like the devil himself. "Hello, sister," she said. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. Everything around her stopped. The walls, the time, the lies. All of it crashing down. "Miss me?" Rachel whispered. And Grace realized, with horror, that the real game had just begun. Daniel stood between them like a man waking from a long sleep. "What is this?" he asked. "Who are you?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Ask her," she said, pointing at Grace. "She's the one pretending to be me." Grace's voice cracked. "Daniel, I can explain." But Rachel was already moving, pulling out photos, emails, hospital records. "She stole my name, my family, my life." Grace tried to speak, but no one was listening. Rachel turned to the children. "How did it feel, Eleanor?" Being comforted. "By a liar? By a woman who pretended to love you?" Eleanor flinched. Lucas looked away. Grace felt her world collapsing. And Rachel? She watched it burn with a satisfied smile. The media found out within hours. Rachel made sure of it. A press release, a tip to the tabloids, a carefully timed leak. Heiress replaced by secret twin. In twisted identity scheme. The headlines spread like wildfire. Cameras swarmed the tower. News vans blocked the street. Grace became the story. The imposter, the fraud, the snake. Strangers screamed outside the building. Former allies disappeared. Lawyers called with threats. Sponsors pulled funding. The foundation suspended her. Daniel refused to speak to her. Mrs. Langford packed her things in silence. And Grace, she sat alone in her room, listening to the world she had borrowed being, ripped from her hands. It was over. Or so it seemed. Grace was escorted out of Lockwood Tower at dawn. No press conference. No statement. Just silence and shame. She wore sunglasses to hide the tears, but the cameras caught everything. The slump in her shoulders, the shaking of her hands. She returned to Waxahachie, to the tiny house where Clara now lay unconscious in a hospital bed, unaware of her daughter's disgrace. The flower shop was gone, foreclosed. Grace walked into the empty space and stood in the dust and shadows. She whispered, "I did this for you." But even the walls didn't believe her anymore. The mirror in the back room still hung on the wall. She stared at it for a long time. "Who am I now?" she asked. And for the first time in her life, she had no answer. Meanwhile, Rachel reclaimed her throne with precision. She appeared on morning shows, told a version of the story where she was the victim of a manipulative sister who had taken advantage of a mental breakdown. "I wanted to help her," she said, her voice trembling. "But she turned on me." The public bought it. Most did, anyway. Donations poured in again. Sponsors returned. Daniel remained silent, but present. Eleanor, though distant, seemed relieved. Lucas stayed out of sight. Rachel moved through the mansion, like a queen restored. But at night, when the lights were off, she would stand in front of her mirror and stare at herself. And what she saw wasn't victory. It was something else, something hollow. Because no matter how much she erased Grace, the warmth her sister brought still lingered in every corner of that house. Daniel watched, always watching, quiet, calculating. He didn't confront Rachel, not directly. But the questions brewed in his eyes. Why had Rachel really left? Why had she never called? Why had Grace been so different? Kinder, softer, more human. One night, Daniel stood in the nursery, a room Rachel had locked years ago after her miscarriage. But during Grace's time, the door had been open. Toys had been cleaned, curtains drawn, sunlight let in. "You mourned what she couldn't," he whispered. He touched the mobile above the crib, remembering how Grace had wept here once, thinking. She was alone, but he'd heard her. And that memory, raw, real, honest, haunted him more than Rachel's polished lies ever could. He knew something wasn't right, and he was done pretending otherwise. Grace was summoned to court 2 weeks later. Charges: fraud, identity theft, trespassing. She wore a plain dress, no makeup, no lawyer, just truth. "I didn't come to steal," she told the judge. "I came because I was desperate, because my mother was dying, and because my sister offered me a way out." The courtroom murmured. Rachel watched, perfectly composed, but something in her jaw twitched. Grace looked at her directly. "You didn't want a sister. You wanted a shadow." Tears welled in her eyes. "But I found a family. I love them. I didn't pretend. I just became." The judge remained unmoved, but the world heard her words, and somewhere in the crowd, someone filmed it. The video went viral, and for the first time, people began to wonder, what if the wrong sister had come back? Public opinion shifted, not quickly, but enough. Bloggers questioned Rachel's timeline. Former staff began speaking out, stories of Rachel's cruelty, her disappearances, her temper. And through it all, Grace remained silent. She returned to the hospital every day, sat by Clara's bedside, and read aloud. Poetry, Bible verses, old letters. She started volunteering at a local shelter. No interviews, no defenses. Just quiet living. And people noticed. A journalist wrote a piece titled, "The Sister Who Stayed Soft." Donations began arriving at the shelter in her name. Grace refused the money, but the story grew. Because truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs time. And Grace, who had once borrowed a life, was now building her own from the ashes. Daniel appeared at the hospital one evening. No cameras, no press, just him. He stood in the doorway for a long time before Grace noticed. When she did, her breath caught. "Why are you here?" she asked. He looked at Clara, then back at her. "To say thank you." Grace's eyes filled. "For what?" Daniel stepped forward. "For being the mother they needed. For being the wife I wished I'd had." Silence fell between them. Then Daniel asked, "Was any of it real?" Grace's voice shook. "All of it." Daniel nodded. "I believe you." And in that moment, without drama or declarations, something healed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. And that was more powerful than anything Rachel had ever known. Rachel watched the footage. Again and again. Daniel at the hospital. Grace holding his hand. The children standing beside them. The press had turned. The board was asking questions. The mansion felt cold again. For the first time, Rachel felt something she didn't recognize. Fear, not of losing money or power, but of being truly alone, because she had won, and yet everything felt hollow. She smashed her phone against the marble wall, screamed into the silence. She doesn't get to take everything. But no one answered, because this time she had no one left to blame. Not Alexei, not Grace, not even her father's ghost. Rachel was alone, in a house full of mirrors that no longer reflected anything worth keeping. News broke days later. An indictment against Rachel Lockwood, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. Alexei had flipped. In exchange for immunity, he gave authorities everything: bank records, emails, voice recordings. Rachel was arrested on the front steps of Lockwood Tower, the same place she had once cast Grace out. Her mugshot spread across the internet. No tears, just fury. But fury couldn't fix what she'd broken. Her assets were frozen. Her title stripped. Her name dragged through every headline. And Grace? She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply whispered, "I forgive you," and turned the page. The court dropped charges against Grace. Public pressure. Rachel's arrest. Clara's condition. Everything played in her favor. She was free. Truly free. Daniel offered to help rebuild her flower shop. Eleanor and Lucas visited every weekend. Clara woke up one morning and said, "You look lighter, baby." Grace smiled. "I think I am." Life didn't go back to what it was. It moved forward. Different, but full. And for the first time, Grace wasn't surviving someone else's story. She was living her own. No costumes, no masks. Just Grace, flawed, forgiven, and finally whole. And so, the tale of two sisters ended not with a war, but with a reckoning. Rachel had built a life on control and shadows. Grace had stumbled into it with fear and heart. One lost everything and still didn't understand why. The other gained something she never asked for and carried it with grace. In a world obsessed with appearances, it was truth that won in the end. Quiet, gentle, undeniable. And as the sun rose over Waxahachie, Grace stepped outside, barefoot in morning dew, and whispered, "Thank you." Because what had begun as a lie had led her straight into the life she was always meant to live. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines began to fade, Grace found herself haunted not by what had happened, but by what had never been explained. There were questions she couldn't shake. Why were she and Rachel separated in the first place? Why had their birth been hidden? And most of all, who were their real parents? These thoughts didn't haunt her like shadows. They burned. Like fire. Because now, stripped of Rachel's name, fame, and power, Grace was still holding on to something Rachel had never truly wanted, the truth. And that truth was no longer just about identity. It was about origin, about bloodlines, about the kind of secrets that don't disappear. They wait to be found. Clara, fragile but lucid, was the first thread in the unraveling. One afternoon, as Grace brushed her hair, Clara whispered, "You had a mark on your foot when I first held you. A small star. Did your sister have one too?" Grace froze. "I don't know." Clara continued, "The nurse who handed you to me said something strange. They were born to power, she said. But power comes with a price." Grace's heart pounded. She had dismissed so many oddities in her past. The tight-lipped orphanage workers, the missing records, the name Lockwood, whispered with reverence before Rachel's adoption. Now it all came back, loud and sharp. There was more. Much more. And Grace knew exactly where to look first. The orphanage where it all began. The building had changed over the years. The paint was new. The rooms converted into a community center. But the basement archives remained untouched. Grace, armed with permission and quiet determination, sifted through boxes of forgotten records. Most were mundane birth logs, vaccination charts. But then she found it, a folder marked Twin. Birth, June 8, 1990. Inside were 2 birth certificates. One read, Infant A, Grace. The other, Infant B, Rachel. No last names. Just initials under mother, MB, and then, written faintly in pencil, father present. See restricted file. Grace's pulse quickened. Who was MB? And why was the father's file sealed? The name was close, so close, but still locked behind something ... protected. Grace wasn't alone in her search. Daniel had quietly begun investigating on his own, unable to let go of the feeling that the truth had yet to reveal its full shape. He visited his own father's estate, where old documents were stored, ones that predated even his marriage to Rachel. In a forgotten ledger of political donors, one name stood out, Miriam Blackwell, a former intern at the Lockwood Foundation, fired under mysterious circumstances in 1989. She disappeared after giving birth and was never seen again. Daniel did the math. The dates matched. So did the initials. Could this be the mother? And more terrifying, was Miriam Blackwell's child tied to his own family's name in more ways than one? Grace and Daniel met one evening to compare notes. They sat in the back of the flower shop, papers spread between them. B is Miriam. Blackwell, Grace said. I'm sure of it, Daniel nodded. She worked with my father. There were rumors, affairs, payoffs. He slid a document toward her, a birth certificate with a redacted name, stamped with a seal from the Lockwood estate. I think your father was mine. Grace went still. You're saying we're related? Daniel shook his head. No, my father, not me. The air shifted. He fathered the twins, Daniel said. You and Rachel, my half-sisters. Grace's stomach turned. Everything inside her cracked open. It wasn't just secrets they were uncovering. It was the truth that they had been entangled long before any of this began. The discovery changed everything. Grace had once believed she and Rachel had been thrown into different lives by chance. But now it was clear they had been strategically separated, protected from a scandal that could have destroyed the Lockwood name. Miriam had been silenced, the twins hidden. One sent into luxury, the other into obscurity. But why? Daniel offered one theory. Rachel was adopted by the Lockwoods to protect the bloodline. But they couldn't take both. 2 girls would raise suspicion, so one was erased. You. Grace felt sick. So I was disposable. No, Daniel said. You were the secret they couldn't afford to keep. The words cut like glass. Grace wasn't just an imposter. She was a legacy they tried to bury. They returned to the hospital where Miriam had supposedly given birth. A retired nurse, now living in a small care home, remembered the night clearly. She came in alone, the woman recalled. Young, scared, beautiful, said she didn't want to name them. just begged me to keep them safe. She had a bruise on her face. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Do you remember who came for her? The nurse nodded. A man in a navy suit. I never saw his face. But I remember his voice, British, cold, said, "We'll handle it from here." Daniel swallowed hard. My father's head of security was British. Grace looked at him. Then it's true. The nurse took her hand. Child, you were loved. Your mother cried as they took you. She didn't want to let go. That was the first time Grace cried not out of pain, but out of a truth finally spoken. That night, Grace lit a candle and sat by Clara's bedside. She told her everything, Miriam, the Lockwoods, the separation. Clara held her hand and whispered, I always knew you were meant for more, but I also knew you needed love, not titles. Grace nodded. You gave me everything. Clara smiled. And you gave me life. For the first time, Grace felt the weight of her name shift. She was not just an orphan, not just a copy. She was a daughter of two women, one who gave her life and one who saved it. She placed Miriam's photo beside Clara's. Two mothers, two worlds, both part of her now. The mystery wasn't solved. It had been reclaimed. But Rachel, she took it differently. When Daniel confronted her with the truth, she laughed. So what? That makes me royalty now? Daniel's face remained hard. It makes you a liar by legacy. Rachel rolled her eyes. Don't act like your family's any cleaner. But something cracked behind her voice. A flicker of something raw. They took her from me, she said suddenly. I didn't get a choice. They put me in the Lockwood house, trained me like a show dog. You think I was privileged? I was a prisoner with diamonds. Daniel stayed silent. Grace was lucky, Rachel muttered. She got to be loved. For a moment. Just a moment, the sisters were no longer enemies. Just two daughters mourning the same ghost. Daniel quietly commissioned a DNA test. Results confirmed everything. The twins were the daughters of Miriam Blackwell and Charles Lockwood, Daniel's father. The scandal broke within hours. The media had a frenzy. Lockwood empire built on illegitimacy, layered across every screen. But Grace didn't run this time. She gave one interview. Just one. I am not here to destroy a name, she said. I'm here to tell the truth about mine. When asked if she wanted anything from the estate, Grace smiled gently. I already have what I need. She looked into the camera. I have a name. I have the truth. And that's enough. As the dust settled, Grace found herself in the Lockwood archives late one night, alone except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the flicker of her phone's flashlight. She uncovered a worn diary, hidden behind thick folders labeled Confidential. It belonged to Evelyn Lockwood, the matriarch who had orchestrated much of the family's history. The diary was a revelation, passages about forbidden love, fear of scandal, and a secret pact to protect the family name. At any cost. One entry chilled Grace. The twins must never meet. Their union threatens everything we have built. Grace read the words again, the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders. It wasn't just a family secret. It was a curse. And she and Rachel were the inheritors. Daniel joined her the next morning, holding a faded photograph he'd discovered. In Evelyn's personal effects, it showed a young woman, strikingly familiar, standing beside a man with hard eyes and a cold smile, his own grandfather. Daniel traced the outline of the woman's face. Miriam, he whispered, not just a servant. She was his equal once. They called her the Phoenix. Grace's heart tightened. The Phoenix, a symbol of rebirth, fire, and destruction. Maybe that's why they hid us, she said. Because like the Phoenix, we could rise from ashes and burn their empire down. The room felt colder. The history between their families was darker than she had imagined. and it was alive, waiting to consume them all. Grace sought out old employees of the Lockwood estate, caretakers, drivers, housekeepers. One, a woman, named Mrs. Calhoun, remembered a night decades ago when Miriam disappeared. There was shouting, she said. Mr. Lockwood was furious. Said something about bloodlines and loyalty. Mrs. Calhoun's eyes filled with tears. She left behind 2 babies. I think she wanted them to be free. Grace's mind raced. Freedom, the word echoed like a promise and a threat. She realized that from the moment they were born, Grace and Rachel had been pawns in a war of power disguised as love. And now, after all the fighting, freedom was the prize they both desperately wanted, though they didn't yet know it. Late one evening, Grace found herself face to face with Rachel in a forgotten garden behind the mansion. The moonlight cast silver shadows over the wilted roses and cracked fountains. Rachel's eyes were sharp, but tired. You think you know everything, she said, but you don't know what it means to live in my skin. Grace stepped forward. Maybe not, but I do know what it means to fight for the truth. There. Voices echoed, a fragile truce forming between sisters who were both victims and warriors. Rachel's voice softened. Maybe we were both trapped. But it doesn't have to end in destruction. Grace nodded. Maybe it doesn't. And for a fleeting moment, the past was not a weapon, but a bridge. The next day, Grace uncovered the key to a locked box in Evelyn's diary, a faded letter addressed to Charles Lockwood. The letter spoke of a promise made in blood and silence, of sacrifices made to protect the empire, and of a child who must live in the shadows for the greater good. The writer's hand trembled as it spoke of love, regret, and a hope that the truth might one day set them free. Grace folded the letter carefully, feeling the weight of ancestors pressing through generations. She understood then that her fight was not just for herself or Rachel. It was for every voice silenced by secrets, for every soul lost to silence. Daniel called a family meeting, inviting both sisters and key members of the Lockwood board. The room was heavy with tension and expectation. He stood, voice steady, but filled with emotion. It's time we stop hiding behind lies and fears. We are all connected, by blood, by pain, and by the choices of those who came before us. Rachel and Grace exchanged a glance, the air between them charged. Daniel continued, I want to propose a new legacy. One where truth is not a threat but a foundation, where family means more than inheritance. The room stirred with whispers and uncertain nods. The past was a storm, but for the first time, there was a window open to sunlight. Eleanor and Lucas, once bitter enemies to Grace, approached her quietly after the meeting. Maybe the family we want doesn't look like the one we had, Eleanor said. Lucas nodded. We want you here, not as a stranger, as someone real. Grace's heart swelled. For years, she'd fought to belong, but now belonging felt different, softer, freer. She realized that families are not only made by blood, but by choice, forgiveness, and courage. And with Daniel, Eleanor, and Lucas beside her, Grace began to believe in a future where secrets would no longer divide, but unite, where love could grow in the soil of honesty. News of the family revelation spread slowly. Some celebrated the bravery. Others criticized the airing of dirty laundry. But Grace stood firm, appearing in interviews alongside Daniel and even Rachel, who had reluctantly agreed to join. Together, they told a story not just of scandal, but of healing. We are not defined by the mistakes of our past, Grace said, but by how we rise from them. It was a message that resonated. Donations to the Lockwood Foundation increased, now earmarked for social justice and support for women and children. Grace watched hope grow from broken roots, and for the first time felt whole. Despite the fragile peace, Grace knew the journey was far from over. The past would continue to echo in unexpected ways. There were still shadows to face, old allies who resented the change, enemies who lurked in dark corners, whispers of betrayals yet uncovered. But Grace was no longer the frightened girl who arrived at the penthouse pretending to be someone else. She was a woman forged in fire and truth, ready to face whatever storms awaited. Because secrets might shape a past, but only courage could carve a future. As dawn broke over Waxahachie, Grace stood on the porch of the small house she had, once called home, now rebuilt with Daniel's help. Clara sat beside her, healthier and smiling. Grace held Miriam's photo close and whispered a prayer of thanks for the mothers who loved fiercely, for the truths that set them free, and for the future they would build together. The past was no longer a chain, but a story, painful, complex, but ultimately theirs to own. And as Grace looked toward the rising sun, she felt a quiet certainty. No matter what shadows had fallen before, she was ready to step into the light. It began with a letter, not an email, not a phone call. A letter, hand-delivered to Grace at the flower shop, sealed with a Lockwood crest. Inside was a court summons. Rachel was pressing formal charges: identity fraud, embezzlement, defamation. The words bled from the page like knives. Grace sat in silence, the sunlight streaming through the window suddenly too bright. Daniel entered minutes later and found her still. "She's not done," Grace whispered. "She's coming for everything." Daniel picked up the letter, read it, then said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he'd known this moment was inevitable. Rachel had been quiet too long, and Rachel Lockwood never stayed quiet unless she was preparing for war. The media frenzy returned with a vengeance. "Sister War Erupts," read one headline. "Grace Blackwell Faces Prison Time," screamed. Another. "Cameras gathered outside Grace's home. Journalists chased Eleanor at school." Rachel, composed and icy, gave a press conference where she delivered a flawless speech about betrayal and stolen identity. "I opened my home to her," she said, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes, "and she repaid me with lies." The performance was masterful. Public sympathy tilted. Grace, once the underdog darling, became suspect again. "I thought she was genuine," one donor told a reporter. "Now I'm not so sure." Grace watched the coverage with clenched fists. "She wants me gone, not just out of her life, erased." Daniel met with his lawyers, trying to shield Grace as much as possible. "Can we countersue?" he asked. The lawyer hesitated. "We'd need concrete evidence that Rachel orchestrated the identity switch, and right now, it's her word against Grace's." Grace stood up. "Then I'll speak." Everyone turned. "I won't hide. Not again." She looked at Daniel. "If I don't defend my truth now, then all of this, everything I went through, means nothing." The room fell silent. And just like that, the decision was made. Grace would stand trial, not just in court, but in front of the world. And this time, she wouldn't be pretending to be anyone but herself. The courthouse was packed on the first day. Press lined the steps. Protesters stood on both sides, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Grace," others waving banners that said, "Fraud is still fraud." Inside, Rachel sat with her legal team, polished to perfection. Across the room, Grace sat with Daniel, her hands trembling. The judge entered. The trial began. Opening statements cut like blades. Rachel's lawyer painted Grace as a cunning imposter, driven by ambition and envy. Grace's attorney told a different story of desperation, manipulation, and ultimately, of love. But the weight of the accusations hung heavy in the room. Grace knew this wasn't just about legal facts. It was about perception. And Rachel had always been a master at controlling the narrative. Rachel took the stand with the poise of a practiced actress. Her voice wavered at just the right moments. She spoke of trauma, betrayal, and the horror of discovering her own sister. Living her life, she fooled my children, my husband, my staff. She dabbed her eyes delicately. She fooled me. Grace watched, jaw tight. The lies slid from Rachel's mouth like honey. But when the cross-examination came, cracks began to show. Grace's lawyer pressed. "Why did you leave in the first place?" Rachel hesitated. "I needed a break." "Why not tell anyone?" "Where you were." Another pause. It was complicated. But the hesitation was enough. The room noticed, and the first seeds of doubt were planted. When Grace took the stand, the room leaned forward. She didn't wear makeup, didn't rehearse lines. She spoke plainly, honestly. "I didn't want to take anything from her. I just wanted to save my mother." Her voice cracked. "Rachel offered me a deal. I didn't know what I was stepping into. But once I did, I tried to make it right." She looked directly at the judge. "I didn't lie for power. I lied out of fear. And then I stayed because I fell in love with a life I never thought I deserved." There was no script, just truth. And sometimes, truth is enough to shift a room. When she stepped down there, were no dry eyes among the jurors. Eleanor and Lucas were called next. Their testimonies were unexpected and powerful. Eleanor, once Rachel's fiercest defender, said softly, "She never really looked at us, not like Grace did." Lucas added, "Rachel was a ghost. Grace was real." The courtroom murmured. Rachel's face tightened. She hadn't expected them to speak, certainly not like that. But their words landed like hammers. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, human, and honest. Grace felt her throat tighten. The children she once feared, would never forgive her, had become her greatest allies. And Rachel, for the first time, looked shaken. The final blow came from an unexpected witness, Alexei, brought in from overseas via subpoena. He entered the courtroom like a shadow from Rachel's past. The prosecution didn't know how much to trust him, but when he spoke, the room went still. "Rachel planned the whole thing," he said. "She coached Grace. She forged the documents. And then she tried to vanish." He produced old messages, voicemails, bank transfers. The evidence was damning. Rachel's face drained of color. She stood up suddenly. "He's lying." The judge banged the gavel. "Sit down, Miss Lockwood." But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the truth had found its voice. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the prosecution rested. Rachel's team asked for a recess. Whispers spread across the press table. Grace sat still, her heart pounding. She had spoken her truth, and now the world had seen what lay beneath Rachel's flawless surface. But trials are never predictable, and redemption doesn't always come cleanly. The judge announced a delay for deliberation. Grace stepped outside into the cold air, reporters shouting questions she couldn't hear. Daniel wrapped a coat around her shoulders. "Whatever happens," he said, "you did the right thing." Grace nodded, but in her chest, uncertainty pulsed like a second heartbeat. The verdict came the next afternoon. The courtroom was silent. Rachel stared ahead, unmoving. Grace held her breath. On the charge of identity fraud, guilty. A collective exhale. On the charge of trespassing, not guilty. More whispers. On the charge of defamation, not guilty. Grace's hands covered her mouth. The judge continued. "It is the opinion of this court that Miss Grace Blackwell acted under manipulation and duress. Charges are dismissed." Daniel let out a quiet breath. Eleanor clapped silently. And Rachel? She didn't move. Just stared. At Grace, at the judge, at the verdict she couldn't control. The war she started had ended, but not in victory. Rachel stormed out of the courtroom, surrounded by cameras, but refused to speak. Her silence, once a symbol of control, now screamed of collapse. That evening, a viral video surfaced of her screaming at her driver, throwing her phone into a fountain. Headlines shifted again. Rachel Lockwood unravels. Public sympathy evaporated. Sponsors withdrew. The Lockwood board removed her from all positions of influence. Daniel received full custody of the children. And yet, Rachel refused to apologize. "The world betrayed me," she muttered to her lawyer. Not the other way around. But no one was listening anymore. Rachel, who had built her empire on perfection, was now its prisoner, alone in a tower of mirrors reflecting nothing but herself. Grace, meanwhile, chose silence, not out of shame, but peace. She declined interviews. She turned down book deals and talk show appearances. Instead, she returned to Waxahachie, opened the flower shop again, and visited the shelter she now funded anonymously. People still approached her, some with praise, others with pity. But Grace never corrected them, because she had learned that some truths are not meant to be shouted, only lived. Daniel visited every weekend with Eleanor and Lucas. They planted sunflowers in her backyard. "They're loud flowers," Grace said once, smiling. "They grow toward the sun like they're yelling, 'I'm here.'" And maybe, in her own quiet way, she was finally yelling too. One afternoon, Rachel appeared at the flower shop, unannounced, uninvited. Grace stepped out from behind the counter, heart steady. The sisters stood in silence, surrounded by hydrangeas and orchids. Rachel looked older, smaller. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This was hers," she said, placing it on the counter. Inside was Miriam's locket, split in two, each half engraved with one name, Grace and Rachel. Rachel's voice cracked. "I kept it all these years. I don't know why." Grace picked it up carefully. "Because part of you knew the truth mattered." Rachel looked away. "I don't expect forgiveness." Grace held her gaze. "Then it might surprise you when it comes." That was the last time Grace saw Rachel. Rumors later said she moved to Europe, living quietly in a small villa by the sea. Some said she painted. Others said she changed her name. But Grace never followed. She didn't need to. Forgiveness, once released, didn't require presence. Only letting go. And Grace had let go of resentment, of fear, of the need to prove herself. She didn't want revenge. She wanted freedom. And sometimes that's the most radical ending of all, not winning, but releasing. Because Grace had discovered that justice without love becomes bitterness, and love without justice becomes blindness. But both together, that was redemption. Months later, Grace sat beside Clara's grave, surrounded by wildflowers. She whispered stories into the wind, about Miriam, about Rachel, about the girl she used to be. "You were right," she said softly. "I was meant for more. But not the more I thought," a soft breeze answered. Grace smiled. Daniel arrived with coffee. Eleanor ran ahead, barefoot. Lucas carried a tiny sprout, another sunflower. "This one's for you, Mom," he said. Grace blinked back tears. She had never birthed them, but they had grown in her heart all the same. And in this patch of earth and memory, she had finally found what every soul craves, a place to belong. The Lockwood estate stood still, elegant, but empty. Without Rachel, its opulence felt hollow. Daniel decided to transform it into a foundation for abandoned children and single mothers. "Let's rewrite its legacy," he told Grace. She nodded. "Let's make it a place where the next Grace ... never has to lie to survive." They walked through the halls together, echoing with forgotten laughter and old ghosts. But now every room had the chance for rebirth. The mansion would no longer be a fortress of control. It would be a sanctuary of healing. And in that transformation, the Lockwood name, once a symbol of power, became a banner of grace. A year later, Grace received a letter postmarked from France. Inside was a photograph. Rachel, standing beside a sunflower field, smiling. No words, no return address, just that single image. Grace stared at it for a long time, then pinned it on her kitchen wall. Maybe she found her way, she murmured. She didn't need more. Closure doesn't always come wrapped in apologies or grand gestures. Sometimes it's just a picture in the mail, a locket on a counter, a breath of wind over a grave. And in those small, fragile moments, life stitches its wounds quietly. Grace never became famous. She never wrote a memoir or gave a TED Talk. But people in town knew her story, or at least the version that mattered. They saw her kindness, her resilience, her ability to bloom even after fire. A teacher once asked Eleanor to write about a hero. She wrote, "My stepmom is the bravest person I know." Not because she fights, but because she forgives. Grace read it in the kitchen and wept silently. Not because she needed validation, but because the little girl who once felt like a mistake had become the woman someone called hero. Daniel proposed on a rainy afternoon in the garden. No grand speech. No audience. Just two people who had walked through fire together. Grace said yes, not out of fairy tale romance, but because love, real love, is forged through truth. Their wedding was small. Sunflowers on every table. Eleanor read a poem. Lucas cried. Clara's photo sat near the altar. And when Grace looked in the mirror that night, she didn't see an imposter or a fraud. She saw a woman who had faced the worst and chosen the best. A woman who had walked through lies, loss, legacy, and still stood tall. And so, the story ended not in prison bars or revenge, but in peace. Grace Blackwell, born into silence, raised in obscurity, and forged through chaos, had finally become who she was always meant to be. Not a reflection of Rachel, not a shadow of legacy, but her own light. A new name wasn't needed. Only the one she had chosen to wear with dignity. Grace, because that's what she gave. And in the quiet of Waxahachie, among flowers and second chances, her name became more than a story. It became a symbol that no matter how dark your past, you can rise. And in rising, help others rise too. Redemption doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, like morning light creeping through old curtains. For Grace, redemption was not one moment, but a series of small choices. Waking up each day and choosing peace over pain, choosing truth over fear, choosing to keep living without bitterness, even after being burned. The trial may have cleared her name legally, but true redemption came from how she chose to walk out of the courtroom, not as a victim or a villain, but as a woman who had finally stopped running from her past, running from her reflection, running from herself. And when she stopped, something miraculous happened. She began to heal. Rachel's fall from grace had been swift and merciless, but Grace never celebrated it. She knew too well the cost of pride, the loneliness of masks. Rachel had been a mirror, warped, cruel at times, but still a reflection of her. And in some strange, unspoken way, they had saved each other. Rachel, by forcing Grace to face the lies. And Grace, by holding a mirror to Rachel's soul. The tragedy wasn't just what had happened between them. It was what had never happened. The sisterhood that might have been. The shared laughter they were denied. And yet, even in the ruins, Grace built an altar of forgiveness. Not for Rachel's sake, but for her own. Daniel had changed too. Once closed off and bitter, he had found a new rhythm to life, not built around control or appearances, but around trust. His love for Grace had not been forged in perfection, but in imperfection. It had survived deception, scandal, and pain, and in surviving, it had become something deeper. "I didn't fall in love with your mask," he told her. "One night, I fell in love with the truth underneath." Grace smiled, tracing the curve of his hand. "That's all I've ever wanted, to be loved without pretending." Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and that made it sacred. Eleanor grew into a young woman who understood both strength and softness. She didn't become her mother. She became herself. She watched Grace closely. How she treated people, how she listened more than she spoke, how she handled wounds without letting them define her. One day, Eleanor told her, "You're not my stepmother. You're my example." Grace wept, not because of the compliment, but because she had finally become the woman she had needed when she was young. A mother figure who didn't wear power like armor, but wore love like a crown. Grace never asked to raise someone else's child, but in doing so, she had raised herself too. Lucas, once distant and volatile, found peace in music. Grace bought him his first guitar. He wrote songs about identity, about second chances, about a woman who saved his life without ever preaching. At a school recital, he dedicated a piece to her. "For Grace," he said, "the first person who saw me, even when I was trying to disappear." Grace clutched Daniel's hand as tears spilled freely. Redemption, she realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a teenager playing guitar in a school auditorium, pouring his heart into chords. And that sound, that trembling, brave sound, became her anthem. Waxahachie embraced Grace again, but this time not as a humble florist or the scandalized twin, but as a symbol of resilience. Women came to her shop with stories of their own: broken marriages, lost children, dreams deferred. Grace listened, not with advice, but with presence. "You don't have to fix everything," she'd say. "You just have to keep blooming." The shop became more than a business. It became a sanctuary, a place where people didn't have to pretend, where scars were seen as beautiful. Grace had once pretended to be someone else to survive. Now, she was teaching others to survive by finally being themselves. One morning, a woman came into the shop holding a newborn. Her eyes were tired, her hands shaking. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed. Grace took the baby gently, cradled it against her chest. "None of us do," she whispered. "But love is enough to begin." That day, the woman left not just with flowers, but with hope. And Grace stood by the door after she left, watching the street, feeling a warmth she couldn't explain. She thought of Miriam, of Clara, of the thousands of women who had quietly mothered the world with no reward. And in that moment, she realized she had become one of them. Daniel built the Lockwood house with Grace, a refuge for women who had nowhere to go. Inside its walls were art rooms, reading spaces, gardens. "They took our names," Grace once said. "Let's give these women theirs back." Survivors of abuse, exploitation, and abandonment began to fill the rooms, not as guests, but as residents of rebirth. Grace knew she couldn't erase every scar, but she could offer soil where something new could grow. And from the pain of one fractured family, dozens of new families began to blossom. Redemption had become legacy, and legacy had become love in action. Years passed. Hair grayed. Children grew, but Grace never stopped planting sunflowers. Each year, on the same day, she walked barefoot into the field Daniel had made for her behind the house. Eleanor joined. Then Lucas, then the women from the shelter, then their children. We bloom together, she'd say. And they would. Yellow petals stretching toward heaven, hearts beating in rhythm with memory. Grace never spoke of Rachel in anger. Only in stories. She was fire, she'd say. Fire can burn. But fire can also light the way. In forgiving Rachel, she had finally forgiven herself. One spring morning, Grace stood in front of a group of girls at Lockwood House. "You may feel invisible now," she told them. "You may feel like a mistake, but you are not your past. You are not your trauma. You are not what they did to you. You are the future. You are the fire that refuses to die." One girl raised her hand. "How do we become like you?" Grace smiled, eyes full of tenderness. "You don't become like me. You become like you. That's the point." The room erupted in quiet claps, and for a Rachel's name was rarely spoken now. Occasionally, her signature would surface on an art exhibit in Marseille, or her initials in the corner of a painting. But no interviews, no memoirs, no returns. And Grace respected that silence. She never tried to chase her down or rekindle what had never truly ignited. Some stories don't end with reunion. They end with release. Rachel had chosen exile, not out of punishment, but perhaps out of understanding that some healing can't happen in the spotlight. Grace often wondered if she ever looked back, if she ever smiled at the memory of sunflowers. But she never needed an answer, because some sisters are connected not by presence, but by the echo of choices made in the dark. Clara's name lived on through the home Grace built, the Clara Foundation. Inside, a portrait of the old woman holding baby Grace hung beside Miriam's. Locket now framed in glass. The two women who gave her life in their own ways, one through blood, the other through sacrifice. Visitors often paused at the display, reading their stories. Some cried, some prayed, and many left changed. Grace never rewrote the past. She honored it. She didn't need to erase pain to find joy. She carried both, like two wings of the same bird, and that made her flight all the more miraculous. She had learned to soar, not despite the weight, but because of it. The community began calling her Mama Grace, a name she never asked for, but wore with quiet pride. She showed up at graduations, funerals, weddings. She blessed babies and stood beside hospital beds. She spoke not from a pulpit, but from gardens and kitchens. Her sermons were lived, not preached. And as she aged, people often asked, "How? Did you get through everything?" Her answer was always the same. "I stopped trying to be anyone else, and I started blooming where I was planted." That became the motto, carved above Lockwood House's gate, a declaration of survival, of beauty rising from soil once cursed. Daniel, her anchor, never stopped loving her with quiet devotion. There, marriage was not flashy or public, but sacred in its steadiness. He would often bring her tea without asking, or hold her hand when no one was watching. They were partners in purpose, lovers in silence. Two people who had seen each other at their worst and still chosen to stay. And in a world that often confused love with drama, they had discovered a secret. Real love is boring sometimes, and that's what makes it beautiful. It's the comfort of coming home, of knowing someone is always in your corner, even when the crowds disappear. On her 65th birthday, Grace stood under the same sunflower arch Daniel had built decades earlier. Children ran around her feet. Music played softly. The women she had once rescued now brought their daughters to her, saying, "She's the reason I'm standing." Grace looked at them, overwhelmed not by pride, but by the awe of what a single act of truth can become. She had only wanted to survive, but in surviving, she had sparked a revolution of restoration. She never became a queen, but she built a kingdom, one without thrones, but filled with thorns turned into blooms. As time moved on, Grace began writing, not for publication, but for the girls at the house. Little stories, parables, letters. She called the collection Letters to the Girl Who Was Me. In it, she wrote things she wished someone had told her. Your name matters. You don't have to be like her to be worthy. Survival is not shameful. It is sacred. The pages were passed from hand to hand, read in whispered rooms, memorized like scripture. One day, Eleanor found one addressed to her. You are not Rachel's daughter. You are your own legacy, and I'm proud to be part of it. It was the greatest gift she ever received. Years later, Grace passed quietly in her sleep. No suffering, no headlines. Just the soft exhale of a soul that had done its work. The town held a memorial, sunflowers everywhere. Women flew in from across the country. Daniel stood with Eleanor and Lucas at the altar, tears in his eyes. She didn't leave us behind, he said. She left herself in all of us. Her ashes were scattered in the sunflower field, just as she had requested. Let me become what I always loved, she wrote. A flower that turns to the light, no matter where it started. After her passing, Grace's writings were compiled into a book, Becoming Grace. It became a quiet bestseller, not for its scandal, but for its soul. It wasn't about Rachel. It wasn't about the trial. It was about becoming. Women read in shelters, book clubs, prisons, schools, and every page carried the weight of one truth. You can survive. You can heal. You can begin again. Grace had once feared her story would end in shame. Instead, it ended in seed. And from that seed, 1,000 new beginnings were born. Lockwood House expanded to 3 new cities. The original flower shop remained. Open, now run by a young girl Grace had once mentored. Daniel continued his work with the foundation. Eleanor became a social worker. Lucas a teacher. The legacy lived not in marble or monuments, but in lives changed. In girls who finally saw themselves as more than broken. In boys who learned that softness is strength. In homes once marked by silence, now filled with laughter. Grace had never intended to start a movement. She had just chosen not to lie anymore. And that simple decision had echoed louder than 1,000 speeches. And so the story ends, not with a twist, not with a headline, but with a field of sunflowers dancing in the wind. Grace Blackwell, once hidden, once hated, once forgotten, had become a name that meant healing, forgiveness, growth. Her life proved something we all need to hear, that even if you start in shadows, even if the world mistakes you, misunderstands you, misnames you, you can still rise. And when you do, the light doesn't just shine on you. It shines through you. That is the power of grace. And that is the end of this story, but only the beginning for someone else. If this story moved your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe now and join a community where love, hope, and second chances come alive with every story. And if someone needs to hear this, share it. You never know how much one story can change a life.